I think the Hexeth speech in Brussels was really the key. I mean, obviously, President Trump is President Trump and he's the man in charge, but they sent Hexeth out to deliver a very clear message. His words were carefully crafted, and I think his speech was truly remarkable in terms of what he said. And Hexeth said quite clearly that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. And he said that Ukraine is not going to get back all of its territory. Now, he didn't stipulate exactly how much territory the United States would be willing to concede to the Russians, but I think it was implicit that those four oblasts plus Crimea are gone. Just to start, it's clear that the Russians have had two central demands since at least June 14th of this year. One is that Ukraine will be a genuinely neutral country. It won't be in NATO, either de jure or de facto. And number two, that the West and Ukraine will recognize the annexation of those four oblasts in the east of Ukraine, plus Crimea. So in a very important way, Hexeth, who was speaking for the administration, was saying that we accept the two principal demands that the Russians make. And that is a major turnaround. I certainly didn't expect it. And it opens the possibility that you'll get an agreement here. But to take this a step further, and Alexander, of course, was getting at this, there's another big dimension to this aside from Ukraine per se, and that is the Americans' relationship or the United States' relationship with Europe. And basically, Hexeth said, if a security guarantee is given to Ukraine, it does not include the United States of America. The Europeans give that security guarantee. This is a quite remarkable statement because we all know, and Zelensky said this, that a security guarantee from the Europeans without the United States and without NATO is meaningless, right? The Europeans can't provide for the security of Ukraine. So the glacial plates are moving here in a very important way. And just to add to this, you want to remember that President Trump has been in office for only about 3 weeks. He 4 more years in front of him, right? And in terms of the U.S.-European relationship, he can fundamentally change that over the course of the next 4 years. But anyway, my second set of points have to do with whether or not we can actually realize a peace agreement. And Alexander concluded by saying this is not clear, that this is a really dicey issue. And I agree with him. And let me tell you what I think are the two main problems. One is, at some point, Trump is going to have to bring the Europeans and the Ukrainians into the deal. It just can't be a U.S.-Russia deal. And I think the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to be roadblocks. If you listen to Keir Starmer, he said today, to my utter amazement, that it's inevitable that Ukraine is going to be brought into NATO. This directly contradicts what the Trump administration is saying. It's a really sort of in-your-face statement. And that makes you wonder how the Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians are going to craft some sort of deal with the Russians that's acceptable to all 4 of those parties. So in a very important way, you see that the United States is beginning to separate itself from Europe. And Hexeth today, I believe, or yesterday in Warsaw said that you want to understand that United States troops in Europe is not forever, or are not forever. This is another quite remarkable statement. No previous policymaker, certainly in the Biden administration, would have said anything like that. The other problem is it's going to take time to make this work. And in the meantime, the Russians are winning on the battlefield. And it is possible that all of this discourse over the past few days will sow further doubts in the minds of soldiers in the Ukrainian military, make them less willing to fight, and facilitate the breakdown of the Ukrainian army, in which case the Russians will conquer more territory. So I think that given the difficulty of putting an agreement together and the danger that the Russians will end up capturing a lot more territory, makes it even harder to see how this is all going to work out. And you want to think about what the implications are of the Russians conquering more territory. It's one thing to talk about signing a deal where the 4 oblasts plus Crimea are lost. It's another thing to talk about a situation where the Russians control 8 or 9 or 7, however many oblasts, a really big slice of the country, and getting the Russians to abandon those additional oblasts that they've conquered so that you can make the deal palatable to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. It's going to be wickedly difficult. One is, I think you're absolutely right that the Russians don't trust us, and for very good reasons. Just looking at Donald Trump and how mercurial he is, he's the last person in the world you really want to trust. So I think what this tells you is that the Russians have a powerful incentive to conquer a lot of territory.
Yeah.
And they have a powerful incentive to weaken Ukraine as much as possible. And what this means is that it will be harder to get a deal. The Russians are not going to be generous because it's not in their strategic interest to be generous when you're dealing with the United States of America, because the United States will take advantage of you. And they're in the driver's seat now on the battlefield. They've got the leverage. And what scares me is that it'll be impossible to get a deal, not just because of the Europeans and the Ukrainians resisting, but just because of what the territorial situation looks like and what the incentives are for Russia to really make Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. And that'll bollocks up the works. I think that if you want a peace deal here, which Trump does, you simply have no choice but to accept the Russians' 2 principal demands. There's just no alternative here. As Alexander said, we have no cards to play. So if you want to end it, you send Pete Hegseth out, and he says there will be a neutral Ukraine, and we will recognize the fact that Russia has annexed certain pieces of territory. There'll be a debate over what that territory should be, but Trump really has no choice here. And if he doesn't accept those demands, the war is just going to go on. Putin has made that manifestly clear. All his lieutenants have made that manifestly clear. It's just pretty straightforward here. And if the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and there are a lot of people in the United States who are very unhappy with this deal, or with the direction that Trump is moving in as well. So let's assume they all prevail. Where does that leave us? If Trump fails to put together a deal and end this war, where does that leave us? Is the United States just going to walk away from Europe anyway? Are they going to say the Europeans won't cooperate with us, therefore let's let the Europeans deal with this problem? That's a possibility. My second point is, on a previous show, Alexander, you said, and I found this very insightful, that one of the reasons that the Europeans are so subservient to the United States is because they fear that we'll leave, right? So they're just very good to us and do what we want. But what you're saying now, which of course is quite correct, is that's gotten them into real trouble because they've never acted independently in the past. Yeah. They're completely subservient to the United States. And now the United States wants to sort of cut their legs out from under them, and they really have nowhere to go. So all of this tells you they would have been much wiser in the past to have stood up to the United States. And if we go back to that April 2008 summit, if Angela Merkel and Sarkozy had really held the line, they had mightily resisted expanding NATO into Ukraine, in all likelihood, we wouldn't be talking about the problem of the United States leaving Europe at this juncture. But they didn't stand up to George W. Bush, and we know what happened after that. Uh, but I think, as we have said before, you don't get the deal that Putin wants, and then it's settled on the battlefield. And if it's settled on the battlefield, it's going to be much worse for NATO and much worse for Ukraine. They would be better off reaching some sort of agreement now. I'm not making the argument that that would be a good agreement from Ukraine's point of view. It's disastrous, but it's the least bad alternative at this point in time. We have pursued this remarkably foolish policy for so long now that we've put ourselves in a situation where the outcome for Ukraine can't be anything short of disastrous. But now we're asking the question, how disastrous? I don't want to be clear here. I'm not making the argument that settling this war on Putin's terms is good for Ukraine in the sense that they're getting a good deal. They're not getting a good deal. They're getting the least bad deal. And that's because the Ukrainians themselves, mainly in the form of Zelensky, and the Americans, mainly in the form of Joe Biden, have pursued this remarkably foolish policy and put us in this terrible situation, which is not easy to get out of. The problem is that huge numbers of people in the West don't understand that. They operate under this illusion that Ukraine is doing fine, and all we have to do is give them a bit more weaponry and fine-tune the fighting machine, and they'll stymie the Russians and eventually roll them back. And if you think like that about the situation on the ground, then obviously you're not going to like this deal at all. But if you face reality, which is what Hexeth and Trump and company are doing, then it's obvious you have no choice here but to end the war on favorable terms, if you can. One, Glenn, going back to where you started a few minutes ago about what's happening on the ground and how that is influencing events. It's very important to understand that Hexeth said, he said explicitly that America's position is a recognition of hard power realities on the ground. Just think about those words. He said this in Brussels. It's a recognition of hard power realities on the ground. In other words, Hexeth understands, the Trump administration understands, we have lost. We have lost this war. The tide has turned against Ukraine and the West. So again, I think the Hexeth speech, when you look at it, is a really quite remarkable document. The number of things that he says in very clear terms that are quite profound. I agree with them. I happen to agree with them. But the things that he says that are quite profound, quite explicit, are really amazing. And I think the Trump administration will build on what Hexeth said. I think that's the foundation. I think they sent him out on purpose to make that set of arguments. Second point, just about multiplayer, I think what's going on here is that the United States wants to pivot to Asia, and it understands that if you pivot to someplace, you have to pivot from someplace. And they want to pivot from Europe and go to Asia. I think that they'd like to pivot from the Middle East as well and put an end to that. But it's much more difficult because of the Israel lobby in the United States to pivot in any meaningful way from the Middle East. But Europe, you can pivot from. I think one of the principal reasons that we're in so much trouble today, we meaning the West, is that we don't pay attention to what I would call brute facts. We fail to recognize brute facts. And we fail to think rationally and logically about all sorts of issues. And what's happened is we've created this sort of ideological straitjacket that if you don't fit into it, you're pushed completely out of the discourse, the mainstream discourse. It's really kind of bizarre. And J.D. Vance was making this point in Munich uh, when he said that, it's a lot like the Soviet Union used to be here in Europe, right? There's this ideological straitjacket. So that people like us who have been arguing against the conventional wisdom for a long, long time, and I do believe we emphasize brute facts and logic. This is not to say we're always right. We've all been wrong on a number of issues. That just goes with the territory. But we're concentrating on the brute facts and we're trying to be as logical as possible. But because we come to conclusions that are outside the ideological straitjacket, you're basically ruled out of court. You're not part of the discourse. So I just think it's very important, especially when you're dealing with national security issues, for people to be brutally honest about what's going on, whether they like it or not. You just, if you want to be a good strategist, you want to think about what's best for your country. Sort of basic intellectual integrity is essential. And I think intellectual integrity has suffered enormous damage since the Cold War ended in 1989. And that's in good part why we're in so much trouble today. So we have this huge number of people in the West who are thinking about Ukraine based on faulty logic and a misunderstanding of the facts. And in those sorts of circumstances, it's no surprise that you're in this disastrous situation. If people had paid serious attention to the facts and had thought logically, we would have shut this war down a good year and a half ago. And it would have been to Ukraine's advantage. And this argument that Ukraine is not losing on the battlefield, it can turn the tide, has nothing to do with facts and logic. And pursuing policies based on that set of facts is destined to do even more damage to Ukraine. The Russians have made it clear, and we've talked about this before, that the Russians don't simply want to settle the conflict in Ukraine. They want a broader security architecture. And it's very important to understand, as we all know, but for viewers to understand, that there are a series of flashpoints outside of Ukraine in Eastern Europe. I like to say it's the Arctic, the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad, Belarus, Moldova, and the Black Sea. These are all potential flashpoints, and it would be very good if we could get some sort of broad security architecture in place that covered at least Eastern Europe so that there won't be trouble in these areas once the Ukraine war is shut down. And the Russians are, in effect, insisting on this. But if they do that, then it'll take even longer to get some sort of meaningful agreement. The discourse in the West, especially in the United States, on Israel and its various wars, is probably even worse than the discourse on Ukraine in Europe and in the West more generally. It's really remarkable how out of touch with reality the discourse on Israel and on the Middle East is in the United States and in Europe. And the end result is you get remarkably foolish policies. Truly amazing. And I think what's happening here is that the Trump administration wants to have good relations with the Russians and, in effect, peel the Russians away from the Chinese. I think that the Trump administration is trying to do what the Nixon administration did when it changed our relationship with China because we didn't like the idea of China and the Soviet Union being the best of friends and us being on the other side of the fence. We brought the Chinese to our side of the fence. I think in this case, what Trump and company are trying to do is bring the Russians over to our side of the fence and put some daylight. Doesn't mean that the Russians and the Americans are going to be bosom buddies or allies or anything like that. But I think that the Trump administration wants to put some daylight between China and Russia, wants to get us out of Europe as much as possible and let us concentrate on East Asia. So what's happened here is, in effect, the Trump administration has said they are accepting the two key parameters that the Russians have put forth, which up to now, hardly anybody in the West has considered acceptable. Those are two of the key arguments that Hegseth laid out yesterday in Brussels. And it's very important to understand that those two arguments, or those 2 points that Hegseth made, dovetail with what were the two principles, or what are the two principal demands of the Russians for getting a peace agreement in Ukraine. In other words, the Russians have said Ukraine cannot be in NATO, number one. And number two, the West has to recognize that we have annexed Crimea and those 4 oblasts in the easternmost part of Ukraine. And what Hegseth said, and what Trump said yesterday, is that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, number one. And number two, that the pre-2014 Ukrainian borders are never going to be seen again as the real borders of Ukraine. And Ukraine is going to have to accept the fact that it's going to lose a sizable chunk of territory. Now, how much territory the Americans are willing to allow the Russians to take was not spelled out. But by implication, it sounded like Hegseth was saying that the Russians can keep those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. I mean, we want to understand that what Trump and Hegseth did yesterday was to radically alter American foreign policy toward Russia and toward Ukraine. And they are cutting against the conventional wisdom. So you would expect John Bolton and the vast majority of security experts in the United States and in Western Europe, or Eastern Europe as well, to be beside themselves, to be enraged by what Trump and Hegseth have done. And of course, the Ukrainians themselves are not going to be happy about this, to put it mildly. And you want to think about the Europeans in this context as well. There are really 3 players on our side: the Americans, and here we're talking about the Trump administration, the Europeans, both West and East Europeans, and then the Ukrainians. And the question you want to ask yourself is, are we really going to pay serious attention to what Ukraine wants and what Europe wants? Or are we just going to negotiate a deal for ourselves? Hegseth made it very clear yesterday that the United States is not going to provide a security guarantee to Ukraine, that it's the responsibility of the Ukrainians, or excuse me, it's the responsibility of the Europeans and other non-Europeans to provide security for Ukraine moving forward. And under no circumstances can NATO do that. So you see what's happening here, and this is my earlier point, is that the Trump administration is basically telling the Europeans, you're responsible for Ukraine. We're walking away. And if we're walking away from Ukraine, we're also walking away from Europe. We're walking away from NATO. Now, I'm overstating the case, but there is a large element of truth in what I'm saying here. But the point is, there's going to be no security guarantee without the United States. You need the United States to have a security guarantee. In fact, you need NATO to have some sort of security guarantee. And what Hegseth is saying, I mean, you want to understand how radical those comments were. He's basically saying, we're washing our hands of Ukraine. Right. We're washing our hands of Europe. The fact is, and again, Hegseth made this clear, we are cutting a deal that reflects the hard realities of power, the power balance on the battlefield. Our side is losing. The Ukrainians and the West are losing to the Russians, and there's no way we can shift the balance. So what leverage do we have? Not a lot. And furthermore, Trump is not interested in playing hardball with the Russians. Trump is interested in having good relations with the Russians and basically getting out of Europe, or at least reducing our commitment to Europe in a fundamental way. And again, this is why
Trump in terms of yesterday's comments, or the Trump administration and yesterday in terms of yesterday's comments, is acting in such a radical way. Listen, let me make a very important point about the comments that were made yesterday, especially by Hegseth, which reflects on this. And I don't think most people are focusing on at this point in time. There are two dimensions to his comments yesterday. One has to do with what we're talking about, which is the deal to settle the war in Ukraine. Hegseth also makes it very clear that the United States is moving away from Europe, and we are shifting the burden for security in Europe to the Europeans, and that the Americans are going to pivot to Asia in a serious way. I mean, he's only been president for 3 weeks, and they're thinking through how they're going to deal with this. You know, this is actually a very tricky issue. If we were to cut the flow of aid to Ukraine right away, it's likely that very shortly thereafter, the Ukrainian military would collapse. The Russians would end up conquering a lot more territory. And then the question becomes, what does the deal look like between Russia on one side and the United States on the other side regarding how much territory the Russians get to keep? If in this scenario that I'm positing, they end up taking a lot more than the 20% of Ukraine that they now control. So the Trump administration has a vested interest as they negotiate this to make sure that the Russians don't take too much territory, because if they take a lot more territory, it'll make it even harder to sell the deal. There are good strategic reasons and historical reasons for the Russians to claim that they should take more than the 20% that you're talking about. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm just saying we have to be very careful here.